It could be a vintage newsreel from the 50s, a flashback to the heyday of Detroit. Beefy Buicks, classic Chevys, Plymouths, Mercuries, the golden age of the automobile. Only this isn't the 1950s, and this isn't Detroit. We're in a country trapped in a 50-year-long time warp. Once this was the playground of the rich and famous, glittering nightclubs, a tropical Vegas. Then in 1958, revolution swept across the landscape.
Lo que no pueden perdonarnos los imperialistas es que estemos aquí y que hayamos hecho una revolución socialista en las propias narices de los Estados Unidos.
Then it seemed time stopped. We have arrived in a country visibly frayed around the edges, yet still architecturally grand. Economically poor, yet culturally rich. We have arrived in a country that has stayed colorfully alive and vibrant. A country that, despite all, has never lost its unbridled, spontaneous, in-your-face zest for life. For many Americans, this has been the Forbidden Island. We have arrived in Cuba. We made the 90-mile hop from Miami to Cuba in April of 2013. Why? Because quite possibly this might be our last chance to see the Forbidden Island, as few Americans have seen it in the last half-century. To see Cuba as it was, after the revolution, but before it becomes just like any other country. Most Americans can probably name only one city in Cuba, Havana. But we began our visit 160 miles away in Cienfuegos, a city where much of Cuba's early history began. Columbus sailed into its bay in 1494, and once it was the stalking ground of the original pirates of the Caribbean. Today it is a busy seaport. The city began here in 1819 in the Parque José Marti. You can find a statue of José Marti in virtually every city and village in Cuba. He is one of the country's most revered patriots, a poet turned soldier, who became a symbol for Cuba's bid for independence against Spain in the 19th century. Marti died fighting the Spanish. Had he lived, he undoubtedly would have been the honored hero at this spot in 1902, the year the Triumphal Arch, the only one in Cuba, was dedicated on the day the Republic of Cuba was constituted. Cienfuegos is Cuba's most architecturally complete city. The name means 100 fires in Spanish, but the city was actually founded by French settlers from Bordeaux and Louisiana. The cathedral off its main square dates from 1869. The Teatro Tomás Terry, the city's opera house, opened in 1889. It was built to fulfill the last will and testament of a local sugar baron and former mayor of the city. Enrico Caruso once sang here. Away from the main square is the well-kept neighborhood of Punta Gorda, the aristocratic quarter of the city in the 1900s. Its brightly colored houses were modeled after the American prefabricated houses that were in vogue in the early 20th century. Its yacht club recalls the grandeur of a bygone age of Cuba's super-rich. But of all the structures in Cienfuegos, this one reflects best the island's legacy of the affluent sugar merchant. Don Acisclo del Valle, once one of the wealthiest men in Cuba, began building his palace in 1913. When he finished it 4 years later, he had managed to incorporate architecture drawn from the Gothic, Venetian, and Moorish styles. Acisclo only lived here for 3 years. By 1922, his mansion was abandoned. Batista wanted to convert it to a casino, but Castro's revolution triumphed, and it became home to an art school. Today it hosts a restaurant. Like many Cuban cities, Cienfuegos treasures its musical heritage. The cha-cha-cha was born here. We, however, were treated to something a step up in elegance. And later, an evening stroll in the warmth of the Cuban sun. It's a new day and we're about to board our Chinese-made bus for a trip into the countryside. But before we get too far, it's a quick stop at a roadside fumigation station, made necessary by a recent outbreak of dengue fever. Hey, a little DDT never hurt anyone, right? Properly purified, we've entered the Valle de los Ingenios, the Valley of the Sugar Mills. Only today there are no more sugar mills in the valley, or for that matter, no fields of sugar cane. Sugar brought great prosperity to colonial Cuba, but the island's sugar industry collapsed in the 1990s, a victim of Soviet-style central planning and the rise of foreign competition. None of the 50 sugar mills that once operated in the valley survived. One of the original haciendas still stands. The former home of Morro Castle, one of Cuba's earliest and wealthiest sugar barons, exists today as a restaurant. Behind it, a working version of the old sugar mill's grinder. It would have been operated by slaves. Outside the hacienda stands a bell tower, nearly 150 feet high. Once it was the tallest structure in Cuba. Isnaga's son Alejo built the tower in 1816 when he took over the plantation from his father. The bell, which once hung from the top, would be rung to announce the beginning and end of the workday. It could also be used to sound an alarm in case of a fire or a slave uprising. But why so tall? Legend has it that it was built as a wager. Alejo was to build a tower while his brother Pedro dug a well. Whoever went the highest or deepest would take control of the plantation. Alejo must have won because Pedro's well has never been found. More likely, the tower was built as a display of the family's power and prestige. On the day we were there, the ruins served as a backdrop for photos of a young Cuban girl. We've moved on to the village of Trinidad. Entering the city on bumpy cobblestone streets, many of these stones came from across the Atlantic a few centuries ago as ballast in ships. Trinidad is one of Cuba's original Spanish cities dating back to 1514. It was from here that the conquistador Hernán Cortés set sail to conquer the Aztecs in Mexico. Once, Trinidad was a booming sugar town, but the Spanish Wars in the late 1800s brought the region's sugar dominance to an end. Trinidad seemed to go to sleep and never really woke up. Today, horse-drawn carts clip-clop down its streets, and an old cowboy poses for us atop his equally old mule. We strolled past homes and storefronts, serenaded by chirping canaries in bamboo cages, a Trinidad tradition. Not many people realize that the village was originally to be ground zero for the 1961 counter-revolution the CIA hoped would topple Castro. But 3 days before the invasion was to begin, President Kennedy ordered the landing zone moved to a less conspicuous place, a swampy part of the coastline called the Bay of Pigs. Trinidad had literally dodged a bullet, and that was fortunate, for today this is one of the crown jewels of Cuba's colonial cities. As we traveled through the small villages and rural regions of Cuba, it became apparent that the revolution is still very much alive, certainly symbolically. Road signs extol the revolution, socialism, and a clear message of Cuba's defiance of the U.S. Images of revolutionary heroes, especially Ernesto Che Guevara, are omnipresent. They appear on billboards, in local artwork, as stenciled portraits on the sides of buildings, on an oil tank, even on the back of our bus, right above the Chinese nameplate. Now we were headed to what certainly can be called the pivotal city of that revolution. Santa Clara, 120 miles from Havana, is today a peaceful city, its shady plaza perfect for escaping the Cuban sun. Perfect place for a Sunday carriage ride, pulled by a goat. where scores of locals line up for a peso's worth of Cuba's best ice cream. Where in the back halls of its Teatro de la Caridad, you can hear the music of the Renaissance and watch young prodigies hone their considerable musical skills. It's a place where music, in fact, bridges both nationalities and generations. There was also dancing in Santa Clara in December 1958. Outside the city, Cuban revolutionaries had defeated the forces of the dictator Batista, and Cubans had a new national hero, the comandante of the victorious rebel army, Ernesto Che Guevara. Today, outside the city, a massive monument honors the man locals affectionately call the Che. The triumph of the revolution molded Cuba's national psyche, but it was at our next stop where Cuba's relations with the U.S. turned decidedly sour. We were headed to the Bahia de Cochinos, or as we know it, the Bay of Pigs. Today, this mangrove-rimmed bay is a picture postcard of turquoise water and secluded beaches. But on April 17, 1961, it was the site of one of the biggest and certainly the most embarrassing blunders in American history. The failed CIA-backed invasion became Cuba's defining moment, the David and Goliath confrontation that vaulted Fidel Castro onto the world stage as the undisputed hero of anti-imperialism. Today along the roadway are monuments to the Cuban soldiers who died repelling the invaders. And a museum at one of the bay's main beaches traces the course of events that led to Fidel's defining military victory. And to add to the macabre nature of the region, the road was littered with the crushed corpses of migrating crabs, those that had failed to escape the tires of passing vehicles. And this live one that stood defiantly in front of our bus, daring us to pass. After 4 days in the Cuban countryside, we have arrived in the capital city of Havana. Beautiful, gritty Havana. A city where restoration is a race against time. And time seems to be winning. We stayed along the Malecon, the city's serpentine seafront drive, a favorite spot for Havaneros to jog, fish, or just get better acquainted. It could be Havana's million-dollar mile, if only there was money. But today, most of the old colonial structures overlooking the ocean have been turned into tenements or cheap rentals, or left to crumble. We looked out over Havana's harbor. As early as 1553, it was the gateway to the New World, rimmed by forts built by the conquistadors to protect their newfound gold and silver. The Morro Castle dates back to 1589. It was built primarily to detect approaching pirate ships. We passed another of Havana's military structures. This pocket-sized fort, surrounded by a moat, is the second oldest in the Americas, and the oldest in Havana. The weather vane at the top of the watchtower honors Inés de Bobadilla. She was Cuba's only female governor, serving as such because her husband, Hernando de Soto, was off in Florida searching for the Fountain of Youth. Old Havana, the historic heart of the city, where after nearly 2 centuries of neglect, the Cuban government has concentrated virtually all its reconstruction efforts. One of the first buildings to be restored was the Grand Palace of the Captain Generals. For 100 years until 1898, this was where the governors, or Captain Generals, enforced Spanish rule. One of those Captain Generals ordered cobblewood installed in front of the palace. Why? So the wooden paving would muffle the clatter of horses and carriages, so he and his wife could enjoy their naps. In its courtyard, a statue of Christopher Columbus. Down the street, the Plaza De La Catedral. Dating back only 2.5 centuries, its original name was the Plaza De La Cienaga, or the Plaza of the Swamp. True to its name, the plaza is dominated by the Cathedral of the Virgin Mary of the Immaculate Conception, but most locals call it the Cathedral San Cristobal. That's because in 1796 a casket was placed in a special place of honor inside the church. Inside, the Spanish believed, were the remains of Christopher Columbus. It stayed inside the church for more than a century. Now most experts agree that it was actually Christopher's son, Diego, inside the coffin. Back outside is Havana's first post office. It dates from 1740, but you can still mail your letters by inserting them into the mouth of a rather unpleasant-looking face in the building's wall. Traditions hold fast in Havana. From this fort built in 1774, a cannon has been fired each evening to announce the closing of the city gates. The gates aren't there anymore, but cadets in 18th century military garb still fire a cannon each evening, precisely at 9 p.m. Morning on the Malecon, and we're off for a trip to Havana's suburbs, but first a stopover at another of the city's iconic sites. Every Cuban city honors José Marti, the hero of independence, but this is by far the most impressive monument. The granite obelisk rises nearly 300 feet, almost dwarfing the statue of the hero himself. But the true iconic building faces it across the Plaza de la Revolucion. Che Guevara once had his office in the Ministry of the Interior, and its 5-story high bronze wire sculpture of the guerrilla fighter has made this one of the most photographed structures in Cuba. We couldn't resist having our own picture taken with the Che. And oh, by the way, the Che isn't the only one with a bronze sculpture. Across the plaza is another. Some visitors think it's Fidel, others say Lenin. But it's Camilo Cienfuegos, another hero of the revolution. Havana is more than just revolutionary plazas and colonial-era buildings. Its 2.2 million residents are spread out through a collection of eclectic neighborhoods. We paid a short visit to one of those neighborhoods, a community known locally as Fusterlandia. It's the residence and studio of José Rodríguez Fuster, an artist who patterns himself after Picasso. Over the last 30 years, Fuster has convinced 80 of his neighbors to use their homes as his personal canvas. In another of Havana's barrios, we found the People's Art Gallery, part of a community development project. In a country where nothing is ever thrown away, tire rims, scraps of wire, even old toilets are all fair game for local artists. And in every neighborhood there is music. One afternoon we visited the home of the one American who might be doing the most to bridge Cuban and U.S. relations, and he's been dead for more than 50 years. This is Finca Vigia, the home of Ernest Hemingway. The author lived here for 22 years. Here he would write For Whom the Bell Tolls and The Old Man in the Sea. It's as if he never left. Nothing has been removed and nothing added. The original bottles of liquor, their labels cracking and peeling, still stand within arm's reach. His stuffed animals are still on the walls and tables. His books are still on their shelves, and reportedly there are some 9,000 of them. Even the penciled daily record of his weight and blood pressure is preserved on the bathroom wall. His typewriter is where he left it on July 25, 1960. He thought he'd be back, but less than a year later in Ketchum, Idaho, he leveled the barrels of a shotgun to his head and pulled the trigger. Several years ago, Finca Vigia was in danger of collapse, but Cuban and American organizations have been working to restore and preserve Hemingway's house. The project has been hailed as a positive model for the future of U.S.-Cuban relations, and recently the cooperation has been expanded to include digitizing papers Hemingway left behind. You can say a great many things about Ernest Hemingway: gifted, hot-tempered, maybe a little crazy, but one thing is for certain, he sure had great taste in real estate. Our visit to Ernest Hemingway's Cuban home had whetted our thirst for more things Ernest. So on the last day we headed to La Floridita, Hemingway's favorite bar and the birthplace of the daiquiri. Of course, it should be pointed out that Ernest had several favorite bars. Suitably refreshed, we struck out toward Centro Havana, the city's central core. And another of the city's symbols, the Museum of the Revolution. Once the palace of the dictator Batista, it was not without symbolism that Castro would turn it into a museum honoring the triumph of the revolution. The Soviet tank in front was supposedly commanded by Fidel at the Bay of Pigs. Across the street, an impromptu game of baseball, still Cuba's national passion. Then it was into the city's Parque Central, its Central Park. On one corner, the Grand Theater of Havana, one of the world's largest opera houses. And across the street, the Capitolio. It's a loose imitation of the Capitol in Washington, D.C., and for 30 years it was the seat of the Cuban government under the dictators Machado and Batista. So Fidel wanted nothing of it when he took control in 1959. Today it houses the Ministry of Science, Technology, and the Environment. There's no question that Cuba has languished in a state of suspended animation for the last half-century. But for those Americans who have been barred from the country, that has just added to our fascination. But change is in the air. The socialist economy is moving inexorably toward the outer fringes of capitalism. There is a smattering of private land ownership. A growing number of businesses are now owned and operated by private entrepreneurs. The old regime there is aging, the hardliners here hopefully softening, and travel to and from the U.S. is becoming more common. Cubans of tomorrow may live in a very different world. But in this era of change, the country's nostalgic trademark may be disappearing. Cuba's days as the world's largest classic car museum may be numbered. They call them Yank tanks, the iconic symbol of this island nation. For 5 decades, the only cars Cubans could buy were those that were on the road before Fidel Castro's 1959 revolution. But 2 years ago, President Raul Castro, Fidel's brother, announced that Cubans could buy cars without any prior authorization. It may be a symbol of what some people are calling an evolution in the revolution.